Welcome to our July West Meets East. We're talking about access at work today, or the account ADA. I'm Heidi Mecham with the Workplace Disability Network of the Black Hills.
And I'm Vicki Stewart with Employment Disability Resources. We're glad you're joining us today.
And because July is the anniversary month of the American Disabilities Act, we wanted to use this session to have a practical conversation about what the ADA means for everyone. I think everyone has questions, always has questions about it. At least over here we do. How about your side, Vicki?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's always questions. And we're not going to do a legal deep dive. We're not offering legal advice. Our goal today really is to help employers better understand the purpose of the ADA, how it shows up in the workplace, and what both employers and employees should understand about reasonable accommodations.
So, and we also definitely, it's going to be just Vicki and I having a conversation today, and we also want to talk about disability in a broad way. Disability is not always visible. It can be physical, it can be sensory, neurological, mental health related issues, chronic, temporary, lifelong, or even acquired later in life.
And because disability experiences are different, the ADA cannot be treated as a one size fits all. That's why the interactive process and individualized conversation matters so much.
So, Vicki, let's start with the bigger picture here. As we said, July marks the anniversary of the ADA. So, why do you think the ADA still matters for employers today?
Sure, this year marks the 36th anniversary of the ADA, and it still matters today because really it's a civil rights law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination. It really helped shift the way our country thinks about disability. It's not just a medical issue, it's not a personal limitation or something to be addressed through charity. The ADA really recognizes that many barriers are created by environments, systems, policies, assumptions, and lack of access. So, for employers, that means disability inclusion is not just about being nice or helpful, it's about equal opportunity. It's about making sure qualified people with disabilities have a fair chance to apply, work, participate, grow, and contribute.
And I think this is such an important topic for you and I to discuss as well, because we both represent multiple spectrums of the ADA and accommodation, whether it's invisible disability, visible disability, a disability that one of us was born with, or a disability that came midway through our lives in the middle of our career. And all of that you just said is also a really important point, because the ADA does not, I think one important thing to remember about the ADA, it does not mean that employers have to lower expectations or remove workplace standards. It means that employers need to look at whether or not a disability related barrier is preventing a qualified person from having equal access to employment with their business. Um, you know, uh, for example, someone may be fully qualified for a job, but the hiring process or a communication method, a physical environment, a schedule, a training format may create an unnecessary barrier, and they just don't realize it. So the ADA really does give employers a framework for looking at those barriers and addressing them when it's reasonable.
Totally agree, Heidi. And when employers hear ADA, many immediately think of ramps, accessible parking spaces, accessible restrooms. Those are important, but what should employers understand beyond physical access?
Physical barrier access is definitely part of the ADA, how to get into a building, how to get to your work spot, how to make sure paths are open and everything's the way it needs to be for that physical stuff. But in employment, the ADA is so much broader than that. I think employers need to understand the ADA can show up throughout the employment process. It can show up in the way that you write your job descriptions. I've had conversations with businesses that say they don't even have a job description for some of their roles and didn't realize that that job description is almost step number one to accommodation because it lays out tasks, it lays out essential duties, it lets people know what is essentially required of them to do the job. It can be in the applications, the interviews, the onboarding, training, supervision. If you have a supervisor that doesn't understand the ADA or what accommodation is about, you could have it potential for liability there because they don't know how to help their employee when they come to them. It can also show up in meetings, communication, promotions, discipline, retention, conversations about performance or workplace barriers. And it also includes things like non-discrimination. It goes into reasonable accommodation, confidentiality, and the interactive process, which a lot of people don't really understand a lot about. It can be physical, like making sure that the meeting location is accessible. It even comes down to how might do some of your work parties, like that Christmas party you do every year. Sure, that venue might be really great, but if you have an employee with an actual visible disability, such as a wheelchair or a walker or something like that, that they rely on, is that venue, some of these buildings in South Dakota are pretty darn old, and is that venue accessible for those employees to get into? Is sometimes it's going to be communication related, like providing captions. I rely on captions, even though I have hearing aids that doesn't do it all for me. So I rely on captions, written instructions, or a different way to receive information. Sometimes it's process related, like adjusting how training is delivered or how a task is completed, because that can go look many different ways as long as you get to that endpoint, which is what employers want. They want that endpoint and that success at the end of the task.
Right. And as we said earlier, this matters because not all disabilities are visible. As someone who uses a wheelchair myself, people might recognize that physical access is important. I may need a ramp to get into the building. I might need a lower desk. I may need an accessible restroom. All of those things matter, but they might not always think of those hidden disabilities like hearing loss, neurological conditions, PTSD, chronic illness, learning disabilities, mental health conditions, or other disabilities that really aren't obvious. Employers should not rely only on what they can see. The ADA requires individualized approach because two people with the same diagnosis might need very different supports, and two people with very different disabilities might need similar workplace changes.
And I have to, you talked about that high accessibility, Vicki, and I have to tell you, I was recently in a hotel room and I went ahead and got the hotel room for for accessibility and accommodation for my hearing needs. And after talking to you about tourism even, I noticed in that hotel room, even things like how the soap is out of reach. I mean, us having these discussions have opened my eyes to so many things that I don't even think I would have paid attention to in the past. When I thought of you, as I'm like, she would never be able to reach that soap. They should be ashamed of themselves. But anyway, um, so reasonable accommodation is one of the most important parts of the ADA for employers to understand. So, Vicki, I'm going to let you explain what reasonable accommodation is in simple terms.
Sure. Really, it's a change or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or a policy that helps a qualified applicant or employee with a disability have equal access to the workplace and to perform the essential functions of the job. Like you talked about earlier, it's very important to have well written job descriptions because a qualified person needs to be able to do the essential functions of a job. It doesn't mean the employer has to remove main duties. It means the employer needs to look at a situation and really ask, is there a reasonable way to remove the disability related barrier so this person can do the job to the best of their ability.
Yeah, I like that description. Good. It's a good one. Um, I think I think this is also where employers get really nervous. They hear accommodation and they think it will automatically be expensive or complicated or risky. Um, and most accommodations are really quite simple. They might involve a written follow-up after meetings, captions like I talked about that I use, um, assistive technology, schedule adjustments, modified training, acquired a workspace, an accessible location, clear instructions, or even a change in how information is communicated. And I think also employers fall to that, to stereotypes and stigmas. Like I've worked in a business where when I was trying to provide an accommodation for an employee I supervised, I even got the question of, well, if I do it for them, I have to do it for all. So, you can see it in employers in the way that they ask us questions and the way that they talk to us that something like the ADA still makes them nervous. And I don't think a lot of employers understand it's there to protect both sides. In reality, it is. It's there to protect and help both sides.
Right. And that's what you and I are here for.
Yes.
If you as a business are nervous or worried about providing reasonable accommodations, please reach out to Heidi and I. We can come to your place of business, sit down and have a discussion about this. It doesn't need to be intimidating. And I think it's important to remember that people with disabilities often bring their own assistive devices or assistive technology with them when they start a job. So, for instance, when I worked at the Independent Living Center, um, it was required that I travel for my job. And I was leasing my own personal vehicle. So I didn't want to put extra miles on that. But there were two work vehicles. So I asked my supervisor if it would be okay to have them install hand controls in the work vehicle so that I could use that like the other employees. And it worked out really good because I happened to have a spare set of hand controls at my home. So I said,
Right.
I'm willing to donate those hand controls to the agency if you would pay for installing them. So it was a win win situation and it wasn't complicated at all. I brought the
Exactly.
idea. It was lower cost to them because I donated the hand controls and it worked out great. So I think it's important to remember that people with disabilities often have ideas of what accommodations they need. So it's not complicated for their employer.
Absolutely. And another example is my hearing loss. I don't, my insurance thankfully covers my hearing aids so that when I show up, they don't have to provide me with those hearing aids. Now, I might ask them, like you found a simple solution with one of their tools. I might ask them for something simple like help with captioning service, but the expensive part, which are those gadgets, those assistive technology in my ear. I shouldn't call them gadgets, I know. But that assistive technology that's in my ears, that's the expensive part of my hearing loss, and that's already in place. So I think the key message to all of this is accommodation supports performance in the workplace. Should help the employee perform the essential functions of the job without taking them away. It allows them to participate in the workplace and meet legitimate expectations for everyone. And when we talk about accommodation supporting performance, believe it or not, it doesn't just impact the person that is being accommodated, but it impacts the entire staff because they see that accommodation happening. And one of the biggest fears an employee can have is, what if something happens to me and I can't keep my job? And that kind of puts their mind at ease that, oh, if this employer is willing to do accommodation for them, then if something happens to me and I can still stay and do my job, but need a little bit of but need some kind of accommodation, there's that reassurance that they'll get it as well.
Exactly. And a lot of times those accommodations help all the other employees as well. Like, let's say, an automatic door opener. Those aren't required by the ADA, but if you have one, and maybe you're carrying a handful of items and you're having difficulty opening the door yourself, even though you don't use
Absolutely.
the wheelchair, you'll use the automatic door opener. So it really benefits everyone. And I think people need to really remember that. So let's talk about some common misunderstandings, Heidi. What's one misunderstanding that you see or you hear in your job?
Well, there was the one that I mentioned earlier. If I do it for one, I have to do it for all is special treatment. But another one is also accommodation means lowering the standard. It this is not what the ADA requires. You can still have the employers can still have their essential job functions, conduct expectations, have their safety standards, productivity standards, and the performance expectations. The question is whether a reasonable accommodation would allow the employee to meet those standards. Another thing that, like another conversation I had where I did a training for a business is one individual approached me and said, well, I mean, so in my area, we have to work with blueprints. So, I mean, that someone being blind should automatically disqualify them, right? And my answer was, it depends. Because if you have that person sitting in front of you, if they can demonstrate to you that they have found a way and learned how to do those tasks, regardless of whether they have that disability or not. If they can demonstrate that they know how to do the tasks of the job, then they're qualified to do it. And it might mean you provide some form of technology to read that blueprint. So, you know, I think that people still sometimes get that idea that a disability means lesser, and that's not necessarily the case, especially now. I mean, we have so much technology out there. I have like these earphones, they help me hear really well. They do bone conduction hearing, so I don't have to stick things in my ear, which drives me nuts. Um, there's so many, this one example of all the technology that's out there. So I think that's the thing to remember is find out if there's a reasonable accommodation that allows the employee to meet those standards.
Yeah, great examples. Very practical. I think another misunderstanding that employers often have is that they have to automatically provide exactly what the employee asks
Yes,
for. And the employee definitely can request a specific accommodation because they know best what they need. And that request always needs to be taken seriously. But the ADA is focused on effective accommodation. So sometimes there might be more than one way to address a barrier.
exactly. Like when you're talking about a stand-up desk, those can range from the whole unit being stand-up, which is a couple $1,000 in some cases, or a little unit that sits on your desktop that just pops up that's a couple $100, as long as the accommodation can be done um, reasonably. Yeah, the employee might want that fancy desk, but if you can get the same results with the pop-up unit, then that's a reasonable accommodation. And employers should also not dismiss these requests, but have a conversation, explore options like what I just talked about. The employee comes in requesting this desk and explore the options with them. Say, hey, that might be out of our budget, but let's look at a couple of other things. But this work for you? But the ADA is focused on effective accommodation. And, there are, in a lot of cases, more than one way to address the barrier that the employee is encountering. Another example, I had a consultation where the employee was neurodivergent and they would get distracted that another employee wanted to listen to music. And their solution was to make this other employee wear earphones to listen to their music. Well, we all sat down and had a conversation and kind of pointed out you can't force someone else to do something like that. But hey, how about we get you a pair of noise reducing earphones? you know different solutions, and while it wasn't exactly what the employee requested, it was still a solution that gave her that quiet that she needed to function.
Yeah, great example. And it worked out for both employees. So that
Exactly.
open conversation is so important. I think employers often also worry about the cost of accommodations. They think they're always going to be expensive.
Yeah.
But research shows that most accommodations don't cost anything. And if there is a cost, it's typically $300 or less. So, the most requested reasonable accommodation by both people with disabilities and without is having a flexible schedule. And again, that's an example of an accommodation that costs the employer nothing.
Well, and even with that, again, yeah, I say so, like when I'm in presentations or trainings and I say something about that, you always get that look from employees about, but I can't do that. It's like, and that's okay. It's got to be reasonable for you in the business. Another important misunderstanding is also around confidentiality. When an employee shares their disability related information, it needs to be handled carefully. Supervisors and coworkers, they don't need to know the personal medical details. They may need to know what adjustment was made or what support is needed, but the employee's diagnosis really remains a private health information unless the employee decides they want to share it. And even then, if they're sharing it with someone, the workplace should all understand there's still that confidentiality piece. They're sharing it with you independently, and it's not your information or your story to share, it's theirs.
Right? Very important. I think employers also misunderstand the interactive process and they assume it's just about documentation or paperwork. While documentation does matter, the interactive process is really just a good faith conversation. It's about understanding the barrier, identifying the essential functions of the job, exploring reasonable options, and following up to see whether the accommodation is effective. Another important thing is that it's not just one conversation, it's not one and done. A person's disability or the effects of it might change over time. So accommodations might need to change over time as well. So there needs to be ongoing conversations to make sure all employees are able to really thrive in the workplace.
Yeah, and be patient. Like Vicki, you were born with your disability, as we've discussed in the past. And so as you said, you've aged, some of your needs, even though you're born with it, some of your needs have adjusted with age. For me, my disability happened in the middle of my life, literally in the middle of my job one day. Some of my stuff did. And so it took me a while to figure out some of the stuff that will work for me. But even then, things change, things adjust. With my age, because mine started 20 years ago, I was relatively younger. So definitely realize I think it's a process. It's not a one and done, and it's an ongoing process for the person as well. Um, I think I think it's also important that we do talk about the other side of the process, and we often talk about what employers misunderstand, but I know for me, what I've started talking about is employees also misunderstand the ADA as well. So, Vicki, what do you think some of the most common employee misunderstandings are?
I think a lot of times people think that they will get exactly what they request for a reasonable accommodation. And as we mentioned before, it's what's most effective for both the employer and the employee. The employee may not get exactly what they requested, but it will still help eliminate those barriers that exist in the workplace. And every employee has the right to ask for that reasonable accommodation. Um, Again, it's really important to have that interactive process so that both the employee and the employer are a part of the decision making. And they both have a role in identifying an effective and reasonable solution.
I agree. That is important. And as we mentioned earlier, employees need to understand. Employers need to provide those essential job tasks that are important to that role, but employees need to understand that they still have to meet those essential functions of the job. The ADA does not remove responsibility to meet legitimate job expectations. And an accommodation can also, it may change how a task is done, when it's done, where it's done, what support is used, but that does not remove the essential purpose of the job. And this is something like when I go do a Let's Talk Work event where we're talking about individuals going into the workplace and the workforce with a disability. That's one of the things I emphasize when I give my presentation to them is as an employee, you have responsibilities of the ADA as well. And it is to know what that job is, to know what your essential duties are, and to know what you need for barriers to be removed to do those essential tasks. It's not fair to look at the employer and say, well, I can't do that anymore, so you have to change the job for me. If you can reasonably do it, okay, but the employer also has a right to say, I cannot reasonably do that.
I'm just looking at the time here, and even though we got started a little bit late, there's only about 5 minutes left. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions. At this point, we can certainly, you can put it in the chat box or unmute and ask your question. All right. Well, it doesn't appear that we have any questions at this point, so we'll continue on. Um, I think another misunderstanding is that employees do not have to explain anything. They can just ask for an accommodation. And while we don't want them to share personal medical details, they don't have to describe a lot, but they should be expected to disclose the necessary information. They need to provide enough information for the employer to understand that there is a disability related need and what workplace barrier is involved.
Yeah, and I think that's especially important with invisible disabilities as well. Um, I think when we're looking at stuff like this, we need to remember that there's the generational factor of each generation has a different way of how they've handled disability and what they are and are not willing to share. But there's also a huge stigma and stereotype around invisible disabilities, especially mental health. So an employer may not know that there is a need unless that employee communicates. You know, this employee may suddenly be struggling. Their work may be now falling off where it hadn't before. Um, you know, there might be signs there that something's going on, but because it's inside of them, it's not visible. So the employee does not always have to use the words ADA or reasonable accommodation, but if there is something that they're struggling with, I always encourage employers to open that door and approach them nicely with words such as, hey, is everything okay? Just know that my door is open. Just let them know that that opportunity to come talk to them is there so that they don't wait until they're in trouble. But also, the employee has to communicate that there is a change or a support that's now needed in relation to something that is going on with them, whether it's long term or short term. Um, they need to also communicate that, hey, I've got something going on. Can I have that conversation?
Right, exactly. And employees do have to participate in the process too. It's not just up to the employer. So that means responding to questions that your employer might have, considering reasonable alternatives. Like we said, you might not get the exact reasonable accommodation you're requesting, but we want to make sure that it works for you. You might need to provide documentation when appropriate. Sometimes, if it's not a visible or obvious disability, your employer may need more medical documentation. And you also are responsible for letting your supervisor or HR know when an accommodation isn't working so that you can go back to that interactive process and figure out something that might work better.
Absolutely. I'm going to pause again. We had someone just join us. Are there Any questions yet about the ADA as an employer, as an employee that you guys want to ask us while we're having this discussion? Okay. Um, so, uh, Vicki, as we're coming to the end of the session, I think one thing that employers really enjoy listening to is what are some practical things that they can do after today's. Sorry, I'm moving this forward a little bit just
Sure,
to the
sure.
time.
No. Yeah, I think it's really important for businesses to review your job descriptions, make sure the essential functions are clear and accurate. If an accommodation request comes up, it's much easier to have those good conversations when the employer understands what duties are truly essential. I think it's really important to train your supervisors or HR. Supervisors are often the first people that employees talk to when they're struggling. So they may need to know how to recognize an accommodation request and how to respond respectfully and who to contact within the organization. And third, I think it's really important to know your process before there's a problem. Employers should know who handles accommodation requests, how information is documented, and how you can really protect that confidentiality.
And I would also add that both employers and employees should ask for help. As I mentioned before, ask for help. Open that door before things become tense or adversarial in the workplace. Do not wait until there is a conflict or someone's performance has gone on for so long that now they're in absolute trouble. Um, you know, open that door early, as I said earlier. Um, it's better to ask questions early and review the situation and approach conversations about this thoughtfully. Make the employee that's struggling comfortable with coming forward to have that conversation.
Exactly. And being respectful of your time and keeping this to our 35 minutes. I just want to thank you for joining us today. Our next West Meets East session will be held Wednesday, August 26th at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Central Time. Again, all of our sessions are free. Our topic will be the interactive process, and our guest will be Moni Patterson with Monument Health. So we'll do a little deeper dive into the interactive process.
She is awesome. And finally, I think I would leave all of you with this one thought. Every person has a path forward, no matter what. And when we remove unnecessary barriers, we level the terrain. We give people a fair opportunity to meet the expectations, the same expectations, without pretending that everyone has to take that same route to get to the end point. Sometimes that looks different than expected, but different does not mean impossible. It just means remove the barriers.
Right. Thank you
Thank,
again. Have a great day.
thank you for joining us.